It's one thing to coach great players. It's another to challenge them to achieve greatness. John Buchanan coached the Australian cricket team during its most dominant era, including names like Shane Warne, Steve Waugh, Ricky Ponting and Adam Gilchrist. A dressing room full of superstars, a team that just kept winning. I'm Tom Andronis, and this is The Story Behind the Story, the podcast where we unpack powerful stories, how they come about, how they move the needle, and how the story behind them differs from what plays out in public. What stood out to me in this conversation was how John approached that elite, high-performance, enormously successful environment. As an outsider, he didn't try to fit in. He leaned into it. He was willing to ask, what's not right here? How do we get better? How do we change the game? Even when that meant taking strong personalities outside their comfort zone. And interestingly, when he reflects on what made that era so great, he doesn't point to the superstars. He points to Andrew Symonds. Enigmatic and enormously popular, but by no means the biggest name in the room. Because success in that team wasn't just about talent. It was about the glue that held the group together. This is the story behind the story of the greatest era of Australian cricket. G'day, John.
G'day, Tom. I thought the interview was over by now. Seems like it's taken that long.
They're just starting. Is it still the case that you're the most successful coach that the Australian cricket team has had?
I don't know. I don't
Yes, you
I don't count the numbers, but obviously we had some pretty good times and pretty good results. So imagine we're up there somewhere.
So we're talking 1999 to 2007, correct? Was your tenure as the Australian cricket coach. 66 test match victories, just 16 losses and 11 draws. That includes 3 Ashes victories, I believe.
Yes.
134 ODI wins, just 34 losses, including 2 World Cups. Is that right?
Correct.
A winning record across all formats north of 75%.
Right.
That's not news to you, surely.
No, I've heard the number. All the sort of exact details, probably not quite across, but yeah.
We're talking about an era that included names like Warne, Ponting, Waugh, Hayden Clark, Symonds, Gilchrist, McGrath, legends of the sport. What's your prevailing feeling when you reflect on that period of your life?
Look, it obviously it was just an incredible period of time. Me, like I'd hope still a lot of young boys and girls these days would love to be wearing a baggy green cap, you know, when you're 5 years old or 6 years old or 7 years old. In my day, you didn't really see you didn't see it on TV. You listened on radio, and so the imagination and what went in your mind was where I created all my dreams about wearing a baggy green cap. These days, obviously, completely different in the sense that you've got so much media around that you probably get to see it and feel like you can touch it, but nonetheless, maybe it makes your dreams far more colourful rather than mine were black and white. So I was never good enough to do that. You know, I chased that dream for as long as I possibly could, and that dream disappeared, and then I chose other things or dreamt about doing other things. But eventually became a professional cricket coach with Queensland in 94. But even then wasn't really dreaming about where that was going to take me. You know, I was just going to coach this Queensland team the best way I possibly could. Didn't know whether I could do it at all. And we were fortunate enough to win a Shield that first year. So I guess I think even though that might have been suggested as well, now you know that you're a coach, I think I found that out 6 months before that I was working in the public service. Had a good job there. My wife was very happy, settled, definite income, secure future, stay in there, work your way up. Oh, life can't be too much better than that. So I decided to go and be a professional sports coach and put my job on hold for 6 months. And then after 6 months, I rang him up and said, don't hold my job anymore. I'm not coming back.
Professional sports coaching is well known for security and tenure.
It is. Yeah. You sort of look into the horizon and think, wow, it'd be nice to make it there one day, but horizons change. But anyway, I coached there, and then it was only towards the end of my time with Queensland, really towards the end of my time with Queensland, that the Australian job came up, and that's when I thought, wow, I felt it was time for me to move on from Queensland. Not sure where I was going to go, but somehow timing kind of worked well, and there was suddenly this job with the Australian cricket team, and so
one of the most coveted jobs in Australian sport.
So albeit that really it only had Bobby Simpson, who started around about 84 as kind of a manager and then moved into the role of coach, finished up in about 92, 93, I think, somewhere around when Mark Taylor took over, and then Jeff Marsh stepped into that role. Jeff, obviously the main predecessor before me, because I think AB might have had the odd stint for a tour or something while there was decision about who would be the next coach, and suddenly there I was. I think it was down to two of us, Steve Rickson and myself, for the job, and I don't know for 100%, but I'm pretty certain that even though Steve Waugh was through and through a blue bag or a New South Wales boy, he pumped for me over Steve Rickson, and that's how I sort of ended up starting in November 99.
So you've touched on this already, though. You are the first Australian cricket coach that didn't have international experience. You didn't play tests. ODIs were sort of they'd only been around a few years at that point, and yet, I've heard you describe your own career, your cricketing playing career, as mediocre.
That's really putting it on a level that it might not deserve.
What are you saying, that mediocre is a generous description?
It could be.
But you've been appointed coach of the Australian national cricket team, and you've walked into this dressing room with Steve Waugh and Glenn McGrath and Adam Gilchrist and Shane Warne. How do you remember sort of feeling like you needed to earn their trust and their respect and a little bit of credibility in that space?
Oh, 100%. The only difference between when I started with Queensland and then when I started with the Australian team was that Queensland, I really had no coaching pedigree, apart from a bit of club cricket and Ian Healy, who was captain of the Queensland side at the time, knew me from being a player coach when he was a young colt. And I had a couple of people in the interview panel who knew me from university career club coaching, but I didn't really have too much behind me, particularly when I was going up against someone like Jeff Thompson and Martin Kent, who were the incumbents for the 4 years previously. But by the time I got to the Australian team, at least I'd had about 5 years of coaching and success with that, with Queensland. So there was that kind of basis, but sitting in the room, and I can still see it, that first test match, which was in Brisbane, and the Australian teams, they only gather together about 3 days out before a test series starts. And sitting in that room, I had, excuse me, I had only one player from Queensland, which was a boy by the name of Scott Muller, who only lasted 2 test matches. But the rest were guys that I'd coached for Queensland against their respective state teams. So I didn't really know them all that well. So to your question, firstly I felt I needed to try to impress them a little bit with where we're going to go as a team. And at the same stage, while I'm trying to impress them with kind of that direction, was also a challenge to them as well. And that was always, we were going on this journey to Everest together. And as I said, I didn't really know, how long that would be, but it was about us changing the way the game was to be played. And so that was the starting point. But to earn their trust, their respect, be credible, that would take time. And I knew that would take time, but at the same stage, I also wanted to take some time to try to understand how this team operated, how this group of people operated. You know, I had some insight, obviously, because we had players from Queensland that were in either the test sides or the one-day sides at that point in time. And so they would often come back and you'd hear various stories, and then just through observation, just watching that Australian team. And so I always felt there was a heck of a lot that could be done with them, even though they were quite successful. They'd won a World Cup, and Steve Waugh had just taken over as captain, and I think they'd recently won the West Indies. They'd won in Sri Lanka, so they were a good side. But I just believe there was so much more. But it wasn't up to me to impose those sort of thoughts immediately. I just needed to go about doing the job, trying to support them as well as I could. At the same stage, making those observations, so that I felt within about 9 months or so, because we had 2 test series against India and Pakistan, a one-day tri-series, which is all at home, and then we got the opportunity to tour New Zealand, so I could see them away from Australia, and so we played 3 tests and I think 5 one-days in New Zealand, of which we won everything but one game.
You talked about climbing Everest together. Tell me about that narrative. What is the story, or even the psychology that you employed to get buy-in from a group of such highly credentialed players?
Yes. Well, what does Everest conjure up in everybody's mind? And so that was symbolic about this notion of changing the game. So the idea is I wanted us to be at the top of the mountain. And I not only wanted to be at the top of the mountain, but I wanted to stay at the top of the mountain. So that was about, well, what was I bringing? I was bringing, certain values, hard work, knowledge. I thought, values of family and integrity. And that, in a sense, is what I was expecting in return. That were the sort of things that would be part of our fabric. But nonetheless, we also needed to develop our technical skills, physical, mental, tactical, technical skills, to the point where we were doing things that other teams couldn't do. Now, to some degree they were, but they weren't doing that consistently. We had players who could do that far better than other players in the team, like McGrath or like Warne, who are greats of the game, and then we had the War Boys in there as well, who were pretty special players. But nonetheless, my view was, as I said, that we could be doing so much better. So the challenge to them was, well, how do we do this? What is it that we need to do? What is it individually we need to do? What are the systems, processes that we need to put in place? And so for me to begin to do that, as I said, I needed to be clear that my observations, either from a distance or by way of input from other people, was accurate. And so once I had that sort of certainty, then my job was to begin to put those in play. But
was buy-in a challenge, or were they willing to come along for the ride?
No, buy-in was always a challenge, no matter whether it was when I started or even when I finished, because it is about trying to be better all the time. Therefore, in a sense, you're trying to make your players not necessarily uncomfortable, but not comfortable in what they're doing. So we might get really good results, but I knew we could do better. And so it was then trying to, either individually or collectively, challenge those results. So they were always, in a sense, a bit on edge, and certainly would resist, because nobody likes it to be there. As an athlete like yourself, fantastic baseballs.
Thank you so much for the compliment.
I was trying to find a word to go with baseball, but anyway.
There are no superlatives.
Yeah,
None.
None, that's right. There's no words that can describe you. No one likes to sort of sit on the edge, because you want to go out and just play. And that's obviously, like Warnie would constantly probably say that back to me, mate. You're making the game so complicated. Just let us go and play, which is very true. Because really athletic performance is about just going out in the field and believing in your own preparation, believing in your own skill, then backing all that in the heat of competition. And whether things are going well or not, you still back yourself to make good choices and changes to keep yourself in the competition, keep yourself, ahead of whatever the game is. So if you then got all these other complications in your mind, very, very hard to do that. So my job was to try to, it's about trying to run almost two things in parallel. One is to ensure that the players feel that they just go and play. But the other is, well, if all we do is just keep doing what we've been doing, we're not going to change the game. We're not going to be ahead of the pack. We're just not going to be able to chase that Everest. So therefore, the other side to that is I've got to find a way to keep challenging them to change, be better in whatever way, shape or form that could be, whether that's, as I said, technical, whether that's as a team, whether that's as a person, all those sorts of things running in parallel. But come game time, try to have it as uncomplicated as possible.
Which must be an incredible balancing act. It sounds to me like you're describing your position almost as like an intentional antagonizer. Like you guys are doing well, but, is that the kind of the position that you assume?
Yeah, well, it is. I think when I look at, say, leaders or leadership these days, I think one of the key roles of leaders is to ensure that you have conflict in your team, in your organisation. And firstly, you do that by the type of people that you select into your team. So if all you want to do is select people that are either like you or never going to challenge you as a leader, then I think it becomes quite bland and banal. And yes, you might achieve some certain things, but you're not going to be able to, I don't think, extend the people in the room. So you definitely need conflict in that dressing room or in your business. Now, the next part of that is, well, what are you going to get out of conflict? And hopefully what you're trying to get out of conflict is questioning of practices and techniques and thoughts and ideas that some will work and some won't work. And so when you talk about trying to keep people with you, then there will be conflict at times as a leader that you realise, well, I've got to let that one go, for now or forever. And other conflict, that you're on the right track and we can keep pursuing this and we'll get some outcome from this and that we'll actually all agree might be the way to go. When I say all, probably it's around 80%, 80% and above. And so, yes, if it's not happening, then one of the roles of the leader is to create the conflict. You've got to find ways and means to create that. Hopefully you keep it under control. And again, in that sense of when we all leave the room, the conflict needs to have been solved. Because if we all leave the room with the conflict unsolved, then potentially that becomes quite corrosive within a group. So it's important that, yes, I think conflict brings and differences brings really good debate, discussion, work at the things that are worth then pursuing, make sure that that's resolved, and then off you go. And so it helps everybody to be a little bit more accountable then to that decision or those decisions.
Yeah. So how was your coaching style different from the people that came before you? We've already kind of established that your experience was very different from the people that came before you. How was your approach to the job different?
Look, I don't know, and I never really tried to explore that too much. Before I came into the Queensland job, Jeff Thompson and so on, most of the people that preceded me, as you were saying before, had long cricket pedigrees. And I think that's always, an advantage. It's like any job. A lot of people feel comfortable in their leader having been there and done that, when that person speaks, well, they're speaking from, a place of knowledge and experience of what that role or that situation might be. The difference for me was, having not been there, my role was then to harness who has been there. And that's how I've always felt, that irrespective of whether you've been there and a so-called seen to be an expert test player or one-day player or IT specialist or investment specialist, there's still so much more knowledge than you have in the room. So it seems really important to me that we've got to try and harness that. And then we were just talking about before, part of that harnessing is the conflict. You get some debate going and discussion going, and I think you get, potentially better ideas and better thoughts rather than it just coming from the one person. So, as I said, I never really wanted to explore what had gone before me because I didn't see that as of any great use. But I suspect one of the key differences would be that because I didn't have that knowledge and experience of having been there and done that, my approach would be, you guys have, or you guys have, but maybe I still need to bring in another expert from outside, not me. My expertise is to try to draw that from you.
You introduced things like data-driven performance, things like varieties of leaders, leadership groups, that sort of stuff, which you look at the AFL and that sort of stuff now, that's par for the course. And yet at the time, my understanding is that wasn't necessarily the norm. Why did you bring it? Was that part of that, antagonistic or attempt to challenge, or why did you sort of feel like it was important to bring in new and fresh ideas?
Well, partly the challenge. If we talk about the data or the leadership, we talk about the data. So, for instance, so when I started with Queensland '94, again, my view of how we provide information back to the players was not good enough. And while a coach can and should always provide some feedback and you make that as immediate as you can and as accurate as you can, and players should share information as well. Often what is happening in those situations is that it's generally the people who speak the loudest or speak the most, and they speak from a viewpoint of their own lenses, what they can remember. And as I said before, it's about harnessing the knowledge. So that's good. I mean, you don't want to lose any of that. But there are so many gaps in that. So to counter those gaps, at this stage, computers hadn't been introduced into certainly cricket, but a lot of sports hadn't really adopted that. Maybe AFL was tinkering with data. I mean, all sports had data, but it was pretty meaningless data for me, albeit that's how I grew up, and that's one of my loves of cricket, was just looking at all the averages and statistics and so on. But in a sense, it's meaningless data. It's kind of lag, it's endpoint data. So what's some of the better information that we could actually gather to help us perform? And so that's where we introduced computers and linking that to the vision, so that if we had a team meeting, we now could hear what everybody said, but now we can fill in the gaps. We can actually use information to present a story with pictures, vision, to emphasise certain things that we want to achieve, either from a previous game or from a game coming up. And so over time, we could then stack it together, and then we could begin to develop trends, and we could develop patterns, so that it put us in a better position to prepare ourselves for a game, individually or collectively. So, that wasn't necessarily received very well early on, because, again, it was new. Famous story with AB was in our old Queensland dressing rooms, and I think we'd won a couple of games, and we had one of our coaches every game was kind of sitting up there in front of a laptop and typing away, and players were intrigued. And so I decided, one post-training day to place some data sheets around, the dressing room to show players, well, this is kind of what we're doing, We're not showing you too much at the moment because we're really in the process of just developing the whole system. As coaches, we're kind of using it, but it's not really ready for you in any sort of raw sense. But anyway, I wanted to just give them an idea. So anyway, AB had his corner of the dressing room, and he just loved talking cricket, and enjoyed the young blokes, the Symonds and the Mars and the Loves and the Kaspoviches and all the young Queensland boys, the Bickles, etc., Matthew Bont. They'd all gather around and have a beer and have a chat, and that was great. So I left these around one day, and my thinking was that'll be good. But you know what? If AB, the legend of the game, this was his last season for ever playing, although he did go on and play one more season, but this supposedly was his last season and he wanted to help Queensland win the Shield. Imagine if he actually asked me a question, and it wouldn't have mattered because I know I could answer it. And in front of the group, novice coach, data, computer, I'll just be so elevated, it'll be the best thing for my coaching career. So anyway, he has a look at the piece of paper, looks at me and starts walking over to me. And so I'm just getting taller every moment he walks closer to me because here it comes. He's just going to ask something and I'll be able to work with it, So anyway, he gets in front of me, looks at me, doesn't say any word, crumples a piece of paper up, throws it at my foot and walks back to his corner. And right at that moment, going from feeling so exhilarated to actually trying to find anything that I could crawl under to hide. Yeah. But that in itself was an incredibly valuable lesson in terms of coaching, that you got to understand everybody is an individual. Everybody is completely different. The way they go about their cricket, their preparation, their planning and so on is different. And sitting on top of that, here's a bloke that's played 20 plus years of international cricket, and now you're actually going to try and present him a piece of paper with some information on it that you believe will actually help him play better, was not the smartest move in hindsight. But anyway, we kind of walked through all that. But eventually, over time, data became just part and parcel of everybody's life. Sometimes it got over the top. With the Australian team, I used to write a report for each of the players after every game with data analysis and a few words and so on. And I remember Darren Lehman coming up to me, at one point through a series and just said, "Hey, coach, probably lay off all the data now because it's lost its impact." The idea was to impact, to get people thinking, but the more they got it, because we were playing so many games, it just lost its way. The leadership one goes back to my own philosophy, in that I just believe everybody's a leader, and you've got to give everybody the chance to lead. Doesn't mean they have a formal role at all, but they need to be able to speak their mind. They need to be able to act sort of independently in a sense within a team framework. But of course, that's not everybody's cup of tea as a leader, because that can really expose you. It can put you on the spot, which it did a number of times, But it's then what you do with that, how you handle it. Most of the time I would handle it reasonably well, sometimes not. But it was about trying to ensure, therefore, that whether you're a new player been in there for a while, or an older player, your views, your opinions, your knowledge, everything was important to the group. And you need to have that opportunity to be able to express that.
You said earlier that some of this more innovative approach, different approach, data, analytics, that kind of stuff didn't necessarily always land particularly well. And I think you've mentioned Shane Warne already. I sense that probably would have been unnatural to him and his style of approach to the game. He famously said some quite non-complimentary things about you over the journey. I've seen quotes like "goose with no idea about cricket." I've seen "living in Pixieland." obviously very critical of your use of data and presumably other parts of your approach as well. How did you manage that when that didn't land with someone like Shane Warne?
Well, to give you maybe an example of why he would say those things, apart from we've just talked about data and going back to my first time with the Australian team and that tour to New Zealand, where I was trying to observe all of them. And our first test match was in Dunedin, and I'd done a bit of research on Dunedin and found that there was an albatross rookery that you could drive to, supposedly only 20 minutes drive till you got to this rookery, which was on mainland. So I said to the whole group after training, a couple of days prior to this test match, we're all going to have a look at this rookery. Because again, why am I doing this? Because I really believe passionately in the fact that you guys have got to get outside the dressing room. You've got to try and expand your horizons in some way, shape or form. And I'm going to assist this, and we'll do this by, in this case, exploring a rookery that, as I understood, there's only a couple of places around the world where you can actually access by mainland. So off we go. In those days, we drove our own vehicles, and we had two, vans, which we equally placed players in. Novice coach, I still remember. This was only about 9 months into the role. I drove one, but I'd let Warne drive the other. So, and he made sure that he got in front of me. So we're driving and winding, and as again, in New Zealand, there's very, very few straight roads. So 20 minutes and we don't seem to be getting anywhere. So Warne pulls his vehicle up. I got no choice but to pull up behind him. And I get out of the car and start walking to see him and see what's going on. And as I'm walking there, I'm thinking about all these things about expanding people's horizons and taking you places where you haven't been and getting outside the dressing room, all that sort of stuff. And I'm thinking, you reckon this is the right time to have this conversation with Warne? So he winds down the window and he says, I'm not going any further. So at that moment I said, no, this is probably not right time. So I said, okay. And he said, look, we got a test match coming up in a couple of days. This is ridiculous, sitting in a van here, going to watch some feathery animals. I'm going to take the van back home. I said, oh, okay. That's a good idea. And anybody that wants to join Warne, you go with Warne. I can understand, you've got your mind on the test match and maybe this is not quite the priority that you see right at this stage, and the rest of you can come with me. So in a broader audience, rather than just you and me, I will just say then, well, I drove off by myself. But in our audience, truth be known, I had 3 or 4 in my vehicle. The rest had gone with Warne. And anyway, so continued on the journey. It took another 15 minutes. Got down to the rookery. And you wouldn't believe this, would you? They actually close a rookery. I could not believe this. Here's some birds on a rock and you put a fence across it and a gate and you can't let people in to see birds on a rock. Anyway, that was the case. The rookery was closed. And so again, novice coach. How do I sort of kind of regather this in my favour here? So I look up in the sky and I see these birds flying around up there. And I say to a couple of blokes, because Steve Waugh was there, I think Andy Bicker was there, 1 or 2 others, and to sort of, think I can pull this back.
I can rescue this.
Yeah. Wow. Look at those birds. That's what I was talking about, these albatross, because the albatross have got the biggest wingspan birds on Earth, and you can still see them. That's unbelievable. And, of course, one of the blokes said, hey, mate, they're seagulls. So I kind of lost the whole box and dice by that stage. So we just hopped back in the van and went back. So context of all that is, here's the coach off in Pixieland or, the goose coach or whatever he might say. But nonetheless, it never deterred me too much from always trying to do some things that were always a little bit different. Certainly from a training perspective, we're always trying to create training to be different because, training can be just boring after a while. Everybody wants to go and play the game, but you got to do a few things to get prepared. So we'd always be fiddling around with that. But this was again more about them as people rather than as cricketers.
And with a personality like Shane Warne, is that almost antagonistic relationship, or was it disrespectful? Did you feel like he was being disrespectful of you, or was it playful? Like, what was it?
I think it was a mixture of everything.
Right.
The biggest thing from Warnie's point of view, which I was saying before, been there, done that. I hadn't worn a baggy green cap, hadn't gone near wearing a baggy green cap. So how could you be coach of the best players in the Australian cricket team? And, he was joining the chorus with, a couple of other former players and journos and so on. But I guess I always saw that as a huge advantage, because I hadn't been there. Therefore, I was always able to look with, I thought, more objectivity. Most of the time. Sometimes I got caught up in it, but most of the times I could look in from outside. And so, therefore, I could always, I think, be in a better place to challenge the individuals or what they were doing. But other times, we would sit down and just have just good conversations, generally not about cricket, because he didn't respect my knowledge of the game at all. So it might be more about family, and it was never about albatross, but or the like. But there were times where you would do that. We'd often, when we come down for the Boxing Day test, he'd always host everybody over, and he was a convivial host for all of us, and happy to see my family and welcome them into his house and show us around. So there were those times as well. And then I think, I think I certainly always had unbelievable respect for what he could do on the field because he was great at the game. And he'd talk you through some of those things, what he was doing out there, how he was thinking, and then he could go and do it. You could appreciate that. I think maybe he respected me for being honest with him, So basically, one of our tours in India, and at one point he hadn't prepared well, and I had to kind of tell him, directly and indirectly, that he was carrying too much weight, which he didn't respond to very well at the time. But he was. And subsequent to that, he got back into training and dropped a lot of weight and was in a better shape for a lot of games that he was playing. So I think, it was all of those things, all at different times. But in the end, I think the most important thing that I worked out with Warnie, the first 18 months was probably difficult with him because we only had, as I said before, Warne, McGrath, the two war boys, and Slater, who was there, but soon wasn't, after maybe a couple of seasons. But was that he had incredible influence over everybody because of who he was. Gradually, though, we established a real core of players that were there for a long period of time, which was like the Langers and the Haydens and the Pontings, the Gilchrists, the Gillespies, etc. And eventually someone like an Andrew Symonds, who, in my view, was how that team really began to sustain performance over a period of time, because it was that leadership culture. It was everybody leading. And so someone like Warne could no longer influence the group or the individuals within the group albeit that he would try as new young players came in, particularly that had blonde hair, Shane Watson or a Michael Clark or a Brett Lee. He would kind of seemingly just always gravitate towards them and certainly try to assist them in terms of, what Test cricket was going to be like, what was it like out in the field, how you do all those sorts of things. But being able to sort of draw them away from the group, if he was doing that consciously or unconsciously, we had this other stronger group around that were managing players like a Warne who might veer off track, and that makes a leader's job, a coach's job, so much easier when you can establish that sort of leadership culture.
So the first couple of years of your tenure, you won a bunch of games. I think it was it 15 or 16 on the trot there for a while.
Yep.
And then Kolkata, 2001.
Yep.
I'm not a big enough cricket devotee to remember that test match, but I'm sure that you do.
Yep.
Australia makes 145 and forces the follow-on and then loses by 171 runs. Take us into the dressing room after that match. What do you go in there and do you talk? Does someone else talk? What do you say to try and realign that group after a loss like that?
Yeah, well, that one was, yes, at the end of 16 test matches in a row, and it was almost the unlosable test. This was Steve Waugh's last tour of India, so it was he termed it the last frontier because Australia hadn't won there in 30 plus years. And we'd won the first test match reasonably convincingly, albeit that it probably masked a few a few fissures, fractures within the way that we played. But our strength is our weakness. Anybody's strength is your weakness. So if you're really good at something, you just keep doing it. But because you just keep doing it, you begin to ignore some signals that maybe you wouldn't have ignored, maybe a few tests earlier, or a few projects earlier, or a few wins earlier. What I'd done after the first test, because Matthew Hayden and Adam Gilchrist had scored hundreds, was to try to capture what I thought we should have done before we left. I wanted to run a 3-day camp before we left for India. We were in Melbourne. We just finished our one-day series here. The outdoor wickets were quite worn, and I thought, well, why don't we now kind of mimic maybe what Indian conditions might be like, but also bring in players who'd been there. So I wanted Dean Jones to come in. I wanted Alan Border to come in. I might have even had Greg Matthews on the list. I can't remember, but I wanted to bring them in, and then let's talk about how you play spin, how you bowl on these wickets. But the team had said, we need a break, and we know how to play in India anyway. I hadn't been there, and so I guess part of it would have been of benefit to me. But anyway, so we win the first test. And so with these two blokes scoring hundreds, I decided, right, well, let's catch that up by spending a bit of a briefing on, well, how'd you go about doing that, Haydos? How'd you go about doing that, Gilly? And for Haydos, it was great because that's the type of person he is. He doesn't mind the detail, doesn't mind the structure. And it was about how he played, right? How he played. Gilly went through his, and it was the worst thing ever for him because Gilly's unstructured, just reacts. He never scored another run on tour after that. Or he might have scored one. He had about 4 innings. I think it might have scored Norton 1 and Norton 0. I can't remember. So come the end of that test match, we made 440. They make 170. We lead by 270. And the players come off. You got about 10 minutes before you decide whether or not you're going to enforce a follow-on or you're not. And I always look back on that and think that was probably one of my worst coaching moments because, as I mentioned before, I think one of the roles of any leader is not to get caught up in the emotion of a situation, whether you're on a sporting field or you're in the business room or in the boardroom. And what happened to me was that I got caught up in the emotion of this. My job when they came off in that 10 minutes was simply to ask them, what other options have we got? That's it. So you either enforce a follow-on or we bat. They're the only two options, right? I think even if I'd asked that question and I was being objective, I still think the answer would have been we enforce a follow-on. Simply because we had a good lead, we hadn't been out in the field very long, and again, remember, our strength was our weakness. We're there to dominate, play aggressive cricket, take the game on. So anyway, but I didn't ask that question. Everybody rolls out, and then the incredible partnership, Laxman and Dravid. And in fact, in that second innings, we had Tendulkar out, we had Ganguly out, we had a third. We had three for about 130. So we're in a reasonably good position. And then these two blokes score runs, and that was because Dravid had struggled the first Test match, had struggled in the first innings, so he got dropped down the order. Laxman had scored some runs in the first Test and top scored in the first innings of this game, so he got pushed up the order. And so these two came together, and gradually they just kept piling on runs. And at one stage, one of the breaks, Steve Waugh came into me and said, "Oh, listen, you need to speak to Warne. He's delirious out there," which he might have been as well, because he was certainly underprepared for that series and carrying a lot of weight. And it was hot, and he was giving his all, but he was just out of it. His bowling accuracy, probably his thinking, because according to Stephen, he said, Warne just wants me to put 4 or 5 blokes out on the leg side and he'll bowl sort of chest high full tosses at them, because he wouldn't have been no ball in those days, and then he reckons they'll miscue one of those and we'll be on a roll. Could have been a good tactic, unusual tactic, which is one of the keys to Warne, that he was always looking at the game quite differently and being able to exploit that. But anyway, lose that game. And so the players come off from that, so that makes it 1-1 the series, and there was nothing to say. I mean, everybody was just exhausted. And also, we had the opportunity to draw the game. I think we were, 3 for 160 with the last session to go. But we didn't know how to do it. That wasn't how we went about playing the game. And Matthew Hayden made runs, but everybody else really just struggled to work out, well, how do you save a game? And, of course, that's when the Indian spinners just took control, and we lost that game, which took us into the third game. And by that stage, I'd had that discussion with Warne about weight and so on, both in the press and with him. And so he didn't talk to me for that Test match. But one of the things about Warne, apart from his skill, and I think it's part and parcel of, and hopefully it's still very much part and parcel of the Australian teams these days, or who gets selected, his passion for playing for Australia was unbelievable. So he was still wounded. He was still obviously overweight, but he was carrying still the physical effects from the last game. But throughout that match, which we almost won, he was the one person that just kept urging everybody on, certainly in the dressing room when we were there, before we go out in the field, or at the start of play. Others would, but he was quite passionate and vocal about it, So coming back to, what does the coach say? I think, again, like all these things, you're trying to read the room. You're trying to read what your role should be in the room at the time. Most of the time, I guess my standard approach would be, just before they're going out, let's just try and sum up what it is that we're going to do to start well in whatever the session is, whether batting or bowling. What is it we're just going to do just for the next 5 overs, the next few overs, to get into that session so that we hopefully can put ourselves into a good position as that session rolls on, rather than it trying to be too much. Otherwise, the approach, and in the meantime, the approach is just to try to get around to certain individuals, listen to them, maybe offer some suggestions if I needed to, or if I felt that they needed to hear something. But otherwise, it's about them being the leader, making good decisions out there, being in a position to do that. Don't make it complicated. Keep it simple.
Throughout your tenure as coach, you set up a dominant team. It was a dominant period in Australian cricket, and it's sort of become the norm now. We just expect Australian cricket teams to behave in that way and perform in that way now. If we lose, it's a drama. We expect that level of excellence now. You won Test series throughout the following few years. You dominated the Ashes. You won World Cups. The list goes on as to what you managed to achieve. 2005, you lost the Ashes. 2006-07 redemption, win the Ashes back. I'm sure that there were plenty of crazy things that go on after Ashes series wins in particular. What do you do with a group of such elite performers after the high of an Ashes series victory? Do you go in there and rev them up? And there's images emblazoned in my memory of Shane Warne, spraying champagne bottles off balconies in cricket grounds and that kind of stuff. Do you go in there and be part of that, or do you just sit back and let the boys kind of be boys?
Well, firstly, you've got to allow people to celebrate success. Whether it's a test match win, a series win, maybe an individual performance, maybe it's breaking a record, but it's important to celebrate success because you want people to get off that. You want them to enjoy it, but if we can celebrate it, then it somewhat puts it aside then, so we can move on. So you mentioned, 2005, obviously we didn't win that series, and that was an incredible series, and the whole range of things that went on there that contributed to us losing and contributed to England winning. But at the end of that series, which finished at the Oval in about August probably, I remember standing out on the ground. I brought the assistant coach out, who was Jamie Symonds at that stage. I brought him out on the ground and said, let's just stand here for a moment. So England were going off, they were just incredible celebrations. And I said, just take this in, listen to this, because this is how we're going to win the Ashes back, right? Our planning starts now, our preparation starts now, and you kind of, in inverted commas, you need to feel this because we don't want to feel this again. And whether I got another chance to do it was debatable because, again, with the Australia-England series, as you mentioned, you kind of get used to winning. Well, one of the things that you can't do is lose the Poms. Absolutely not. And I found that out very quick smart there because the board said, you got to come down to cricket headquarters and just tell us why you should be retained as coach. And so, that gave me some clear thinking. It's not as though you don't kind of review all the time, but this was clarity of thinking about, well, should I, shouldn't I still do the job? So I often say to various leaders, I think they're questions that you'll ask yourself if you haven't already in your own business or in your organisation. And one was, could I still make a difference with this group? Because that was 6 years on and we'd won a lot of things, albeit we just lost an Ashes series, but most things we'd done pretty well at, set some new records and so on. So could I really still make a difference so that we could achieve new things, Then the next question to myself was, did I want to? Did I have the energy, the passion, the desire, which is you're away 250, 260 nights a year, you're training, you're playing, you're travelling, you got the press over you, got the odd incident that would happen or somebody makes a comment, not these days, even worse with social media, we didn't have that around those days. But could I still get up every morning and really want to have a crack at this? So that was, and then the third question was to the leadership, formal leadership team, which was, you know, Ponding and Gilchrist and a couple of senior players, you know, Matthew Hayden, etc. You still want me to do it, you know? So
What did they say?
Well, if they said no, we wouldn't be here talking about anything beyond 2005.
Yeah, right.
But they said yes, and I'd already said I could make a difference, and I wanted to have another crack. But I only had in my mind 20 months, or about a 20-month plan, and that's what I then presented to the board, and that was taking us to the end of the World Cup 2007. And at that stage, I knew one of the first two questions to myself would be a no, and as soon as one of those was a no, then I wasn't going any further, because I knew I'd lose the respect and the confidence and the belief from the players. So that's what I painted, and the board gave me an opportunity to begin that, and we started well, and we continued to go well most of that time, and then going back to where this podcast started, where I talked about Everest. So this was kind of the final Everest, and that was, we had 3 tournaments. We had an ICC trophy in India in about August 2006. Then, as you mentioned, Poms were coming back, so we had an opportunity to get the Ashes back. And then the third was going to the World Cup and making that, certainly 2 in a row for me, but 3 in a row for the team.
So you do end up winning that 2007 World Cup. And so presumably at the end of that, one of the answers to those first 2 questions became no.
Well, I'd already answered that.
You'd already answered it for yourself 20 months in advance.
Yeah, 20 months in advance.
Right.
That was what I presented to the board.
Which question was it?
Which one would it have been?
Yeah. Which question did you answer no to?
Well, I didn't have... Well, rewind. I answered yes and yes to the first 2 questions, which are my own, and then yes from the players. But I knew more practically, I just couldn't keep going.
Just a bit spent.
Yeah. I wouldn't have the passion or desire to do it. I mean, I might have it sometimes, but I'll be inconsistent. So, yeah.
Looking back now, what do you think, what's a story from that period of Australian cricket, from your tenure as the senior coach of the Australian cricket side, that perhaps has been misunderstood by the Australian public, that people think they understand, that perhaps they don't?
Well, I think one thing that most people don't appreciate is that winning is not easy. 1 game, 2 games, 3 games, a series, stacking series upon series together, home and away. Just winning is not easy. And test matches, if we stick with test matches, they're 5-day games. And a lot happens in 5-day games, to players, both in your team and an opposition team, to weather conditions, to wickets. So, and as you said before, winning just seemed to be something that was expected. And it just isn't as easy as it seems to be sometimes. Conversely, when teams are losing, winning seems very hard, as well. Losing seems very easy, But and so everything that I think goes into that is probably not well understood by a public, that whenever we look at sport, and whether it be short duration sport, game of basketball or hockey, or that lasts for maybe an hour or hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever, irrespective of the length of the game, there is so much that goes into actually trying to get a W in the column rather than an L.
And then 15 or 20 years down the track, we talk about them in such large numbers, 161 wins, 35 losses, that kind of thing, and yet every one of those wins is the sum of so many moving parts that are really, really difficult to understand when you're not inside of it.
They are, and to some degree it's just very much the same in business. I mean, the thing about the sport, as you say, whether it's 161 wins, I was just thinking as you're saying that, there's just things like selections, getting the right people, getting the right mix of people, injuries that take people away, and sitting in behind that are families that have to support those individuals who are away, a lot of the times, and sometimes they don't go away because of their families. And so business is much the same, except that we don't spend enough time almost putting it on a scoreboard so that it's seen to be that, because it is. Every day in business is competition. You're actually in competition. The world is not stopping because you've got a rostered day off, or you're taking, you've got sick leave, or you've got holidays. Competition is still going on. The world of business is still going on. And so, in a sense, we could, or businesses could, kind of measure their own scoreboards on a far more regular basis than what they do, rather than leaving it for a quarter or 6 months, or doing a performance review every 12 months, all those sorts of things. I guess the stock market is one of those things that can tell businesses on a regular basis how they're performing, at least a result, right? But coming back to what we were just saying, a result, win or lose, there's so much that has to go into that. So even as a business, if I get my share price today, well, what is it that I control that enable that to happen? There are lots of other factors out there, because out of our 161 wins or 34 losses, there are lots of other things in that win or lose that were outside of our control. But we had to make sure that we spent most of our time and energy on the things that we controlled, so that we could respond to the marketplace as quickly as we possibly could.
If you had to choose a moment or a story or an experience or a memory from your tenure as Australian coach that really kind of sums up the spirit of that team and the culture of that team and the level of achievement that you did actually manage to attain, what would it be?
I guess there's a number of things that kind of flash before your mind in that regard, but there's one in a sense that does that, and that was Andrew Symonds making his 100 in Melbourne with Matthew Hayden. And why? One, I guess Andrew was, just a personal favourite. So a person that, made a lot of errors in his career, made ultimately one error that cost him his life. But he was the type of player that brought a team together. Didn't have a formal role as a leader, but to me was always incredibly important to have in the group because of his personal leadership skills. So he trained hard, he played hard, he respected other people, he was humble. As I said, he made some errors, and it's a bit of an old cliche all these days. Everybody says, "Oh, I'm sorry I did that." Well, he would probably say, "I'm sorry I did that too," but you knew there was total authenticity behind that, that it was, just I made a really bad decision and was willing to take whatever that meant. A story about Andrew early in his career, really early in his Australian career. He came into the Queensland team when he was about 19. But he came into the Australian team when, say, he was maybe early 20s and just breaking in. Everybody knew he had incredible ability. Just breaking in, and we're on this first tour of England, 2001, and he was playing the one-day series. That's all he was selected for. We played the one-day series, and he was about to leave the group with a couple of other blokes who were going home, and the test players come in and replace them. And he said to Stephen Moore and I, "Can I see you boys quickly before I go?" I said, "Sure." And he walked into this room with us, and the first thing he said, "I'm going to retire." And we're like you, we're just stunned. What do you mean? you know, you wanted to play for Australia. That's your ultimate goal. You've now just got a taste of it. You've done reasonably well, and, you know, who knows what's ahead. And he said, I just don't like the room. He said, there's some people in there that I don't respect and I can't trust. And he said, if I can't trust people in the room, I don't want to be part of it. So that's why I'm giving it away. And obviously we had some sort of conversation with him, trying to convince him to say, you know, sleep on it, think about it when you get home, talk to your parents, talk to other people over there. Anyway, by the time we got back to Australia, and that was the other thing he said, and I'm going to go and play for the Broncos because he loved his rugby league. He was a physical sort of guy, so, you know, whenever we played touch football with him, I remember him, because I'd play touch, and I remember him just picking me up one time and dropping me on the ground because I was being a bit silly. So he said, "You're not going to be silly anymore, are you?" I wasn't after that. But anyway, by the time we got home, he was back playing cricket. And so obviously Wayne Bennett, who's a legendary rugby league coach, I think would have had the conversation with him to say, "Roy, Andrew, as a rugby league player, you're a good cricketer." But back to Andrew, you know, he had so much ability all the time and just gradually was showing that, understanding that, developing that. Good one-day player, gradually getting into the test side, and then finally cracking this 100 in Melbourne, which was, you know, probably for him a dream come true. But for everybody in that Australian group, everybody was up, you know. It was an incredible moment for him, but for everybody else, family and so on. So to me, that was, you know, as I said, there's a million highlights, absolutely a million highlights, but that probably emphasised something that was, I thought, really important to the way that we played as a group, because you could see that was all just about family. It was about success, that partly. It was about an outcome, it was about something but it was about, here was a family of which somebody had achieved something special for himself, but it was probably almost more important to the group.
John, thanks for sharing. Thanks for taking us behind the story.
Happy to do so, Tom. Thank you.
If this story made you think, reflect, or be inspired, please share it with someone who should hear it. You can follow the story behind the story wherever you listen to podcasts and find out more on our socials. I'm Tom Andronis. Thanks for tuning in.